LinkedIn presents.
This idea that we should be resolutely positive, that we shouldn't look backward, that regret is something to be avoided is wrong. It is wrong. I don't know if it's morally wrong, but it's wrong as a matter of science. And it's a completely useless blueprint for living.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, can looking back move you forward? Paris, October 1960. A young songwriter named Charles Dumont stands at the front door of an imposing apartment building in the city's 16th arrondissement. Beside him, his professional partner, Michel. Before him, an opportunity. One Charles desperately needs. A chance to play one of his songs for the most famous singer in France. If he's lucky, she'll like it. Like it so much that he'll make some money. Enough money that he can finally get some furniture for his apartment. Nervously, he rings the bell. The door opens. Charles and Michel are ushered into one of the apartments and immediately given bad news. Their appointment has been canceled. The woman they're here to see doesn't want to see them. They turn to go, but then a woman's voice rings out from down the hall. It's more of a growl, really. Since you've come all this way, she says, you may as well stay. So Charles and Michel go into the living room to wait, and wait, and wait some more. Finally, an hour later, into the room strides a woman, the woman, a blue dressing gown wrapped around her gaunt frame. It's Edith Piaf. She's 44 years old and one of the most famous singers in the world. She's also one of the sickest, her body ravaged by addiction and hard living. Just 3 months earlier, she'd been in a coma. She looks at the two men and tells them she'll hear one song, just one. Charles, who has a wife and 2 kids at home that he can barely afford to feed, will quite literally have to sing for his supper. He goes over to the piano, sits down, and starts to play. No great chanteuse, he speaks the words Michel has written. Non, rien de rien. Non, je ne regrette rien. No, nothing at all. No, I regret nothing at all. As soon as he's finished, Piaf asks him to play it again. After hearing the song a second time, she asks, "Did you really write that? You?" He tells her yes. She calls in her household staff and tells Charles to play the song. She calls in some friends who happen to be hanging around and tells Charles to play the song. She makes him play it over and over, more than 20 times, thinking each time she hears it, that song will conquer the world. And it does. In December, at a sold-out performance promoted as her comeback, she performs Non, je ne regrette rien as her final number and receives 22 curtain calls. In January, she puts it on tape and sells 100,000 records in 2 days. By the end of 1961, Non, je ne regrette rien will sell more than 1 million copies. And by the end of 1963, Edith Piaf will be dead. That song gave the motto to a movement, one that is alive and well today. No regrets. It's a staple of Twitter and tattoo parlors. It's a credo that Edith Piaf herself seemed to embrace. If I had to live my life over again, she once said, I'd do it just the same. That struck my guest today, the acclaimed writer, mensch, and Next Big Idea Club curator, Daniel Pink, as rather odd. As he observes in his new book, The Power of Regret, How Looking Backwards Moves Us Forward, a quick review of Piaf's 47 years on Earth reveals a life awash in tragedy and troubles. It's difficult to picture Piaf on her deathbed celebrating her decisions. Yet Piaf was not alone in proclaiming her disdain for regrets. The anti-regret philosophy, Dan says, is as pervasive as it is dead wrong. Regrets aren't something to be ashamed of or embarrassed by. They help us make smarter decisions. They remind us of our values. They deepen our sense of meaning and purpose. They're essential. As another famous song has it, regrets? I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. If Dan Pink had written that song, he would have written, regrets? I've had a lot. And you know what? That's a good thing. As it turns out, when you survey tens of thousands of people around the world and ask them about their regrets, the responses you get are very consistent. And those responses provide us with, as Dan puts it, a photographic negative of the good life. None of us will live lives free of regret, irrespective of what we say out loud or get tattooed on our backsides. But if we take some time to study what other people regret over the course of their lives, we might just end up with a few less of them.
If you're interested in the story behind the business headlines, check out Big Technology Podcast, my weekly show that features in-depth interviews with CEOs, researchers, and reformers in business and technology. Hi, I'm Alex Kantrowitz. I'm a longtime journalist, CNBC contributor, and the host of the show. I empty my Rolodex every Wednesday to bring you awesome episodes, so go check out Big Technology Podcast. It's available on all podcast apps. Would love to have you as a listener.
Daniel Pink, welcome back to the Next Big Idea podcast.
Rufus Griscom, thank you for having me back to the Next Big Idea podcast.
Dan, first of all, I want to thank you for being a curator of the Next Big Idea Club. I think a lot of people listening and all the wonderful authors whose work we've helped reach a bigger audience really appreciate the work you've done on this.
Well, I'm so glad to do it. And you guys have we've built such a great community of readers, and we've been able to draw some attention to books that might otherwise have not gotten the attention that they deserve. It's so hard to get worthy books noticed. And so anything we can do to bring them to more people and get them in more hands is an important deed.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, you've written an extraordinary series of best-selling books, including, but not limited to, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us, To Sell Is Human, and When, The Scientific Secret of Perfect Timing. Secrets, plural, I should say. I don't want to rob our listeners of the many secrets of perfect timing. And I don't know if I've had a chance to tell you, Dan, that both Drive and When are books that have meaningfully impacted my life. Like, I live my life on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, wow.
A little bit different because of those books. I've cited them to friends dozens of times. Drive validated my decision to be a serial entrepreneur. We all need our decisions validated. And influenced my thinking about management. And When caused me not only to reschedule a colonoscopy, but to modify how I schedule my days, literally including this morning. So thank you for that.
That's good to hear. You might have kept me in the writing business for another week.
I've definitely done my part, for sure. Your latest book, The Power of Regret, How Looking Backwards Moves Us Forwards, is maybe my favorite of them all, which is saying something.
Huh.
I'm curious about what drew you to the subject of regret. My understanding is that it all started in 2019 at your daughter's college graduation. Is that
is
that
true.
Correct?
You're a parent, so you can understand this. You haven't quite hit the point where one of your kids has graduated from college. But when my elder daughter graduated from college, it was a little bit of an out-of-body experience because it's sort of a marker for time going
Sure.
so fast. It's almost like you blink an eye and the kid is born, and then suddenly she's striding across the stage getting a diploma. And as I was doing that, my mind starts to wander, and it wandered to my own college experience, which was generally pretty happy. But I started thinking about my own regrets in college, really regrets about kindness, regrets about not working hard enough, regrets about not taking enough risks. And when I came back and started discussing them with people, I found that people, in contrast to what you might expect, people leaned into they wanted to talk about this stuff. They wanted to share theirs. And as a writer, that's always a very interesting response. As a writer, I'm a big believer in when you have ideas or when you're curious about something, you don't keep it to yourself. You socialize it. You put it out there because the reaction you get from people is always fascinating. And I've had so many times where people are just like, okay, I couldn't care less about what you're talking about. Can we please return to talking about sports or home renovation or something? And in this case, people really leaned in, and it was almost like gut instinct, Rufus, where it's like, whoa, wait a second, this is a different kind of response. There's a depth to it. There's a an electricity to it that really surprised me. And so I actually put aside an entirely different book and essentially restarted, wrote an entirely new book proposal around this.
And there's also something contestable, isn't there, in the sense that you have this culture of no regrets, what you call the life-thwarting nonsense of no regrets. There's a puzzle there to be solved, and there's a bit of a debate at the center of this, isn't there?
That's a really good point. I think it's a really good point in books in general, that you do want to take on something that's contestable. I mean, I think too often what you see in some nonfiction are books that simply confirm what we already believe and try to do that in clever ways. And what I tried to do here is I wanted to contest this idea, because based on my research, my initial research when I was formulating the idea, and then my subsequent research, both my own look at the academic research and my own research projects, it was this is a proposition, this idea that we should be resolutely positive, that we shouldn't look backward, that regret is something to be avoided, is wrong. It is wrong. I don't know if it's morally wrong, but it's wrong as a matter of science, and it's a completely useless blueprint for living.
It is so puzzling to me. My father has said to me over the years that he has no regrets. And I always paused when he said that and thought, how could you have no regrets? I think he means something maybe different by it.
What do you think he means?
I think he might mean that I think he would say that he has made mistakes and he's learned from those mistakes, but he's a product of that path. And he's grateful for all that has come his way. I think on some level, it's an expression of gratitude for him.
That makes perfect sense, in that kind of approach. But I think that it's also a reflection of the demonization of this very concept.
Yes.
So the thing is that you can be grateful and have regrets at the same time.
Yes.
You can say, I'm happy and grateful for the life that I have, but I do have some regrets. Those things to me are perfectly compatible. One doesn't extinguish the other.
That's right. That's right. And it's somewhat of a product perhaps of a culture of not embracing failure as we should. And there's been more and more evidence, hasn't there, in the studies that embracing failure, treating failure as a data point, that this is tremendously empowering.
Yeah, I think so. And I think oftentimes in organizations that's honored more in the breach than in the observance. With regret, I think that regret is different from failure. Failing and making a mistake are they're actions, obviously. But regret is an emotion. It's an emotion that comes from behavior, but it's an emotion. And I think that the fact that it is a feeling complicates things. I think the fact that it is a feeling that your father is having makes it even more worrisome. And to me, one of the things that I've discovered in some ways, Rufus, almost subsequent to the book coming out, is how difficult a time we have dealing with negative emotions.
Yeah.
Not because we're fundamentally ill-equipped to deal with them, but because no one ever teaches us how to do that.
As you point out, regret is uniquely human, and you refer to it as a sophisticated mental trapeze act.
Yeah.
I mean, it's worth being a little bit in awe of kind of the sophistication of what we're doing with regret.
Heck yeah. One of the things that you realize, in the stuff that I've written about over the last 20 years is that our brains are pretty freaking amazing. I mean, it's kind of amazing what human beings can do with this 3-pound thing inside of our head. I mean, even to some extent, Rufus, what you and I are doing right now, I'm making sounds out of a hole in my mouth. But what that's doing is that that's conveying these complex ideas from my head into your head. That's an amazing thing when you think about it. I mean, that's just incredible when you think about it. And so regret is pretty sophisticated, and it involves two key aspects. One of them is time travel. The other one is storytelling. And if you think about it, let's just talk about what regret is. So let's say that, I don't know, let's pick a regret. I have, or let's pick a person's regret. So let's say we have, I'm just looking around my desk here. I have a Charles Darwin doll here. So let's say we have a guy named Charles. All right. And let's say Charles regrets. What do we want to have Charles regret? Let's say Charles regrets not pursuing, becoming an accountant and not becoming an artist. All right, because he loved fine arts.
Sure.
Okay, so how does Charles even process that? Here's what he does: he gets in a mental time machine. He goes back in his mental time machine to when he was, say, a teenager or when a university student making decisions about what to do with his life. All right, he knows the decision was really made, but he's enough of a storyteller that he can conjure a counterfactual circumstance where he says, forget about accountancy, I'm going to go study the fine arts, all right? So that's pretty amazing right there, but it's not even done. Then he gets back in his time machine, beep, zips back to the present, but he's such an incredible storyteller. His brain is so supple that because he's reconfigured the past, the present that he's arriving in now itself is reconfigured, and he's now living in a garret and smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee, but is, impoverished but happy. And that's just kind of incredible. And the thing about it is that we do it pretty much effortlessly.
Mm-hmm.
The cognitive sophistication of this gives us clues about why regret is important. So it tells us in part why 5-year-olds don't experience regret, because they haven't developed that. It's the same reason that 5-year-olds can't lift heavy objects and can't run that fast, because they haven't developed enough. It also shows why it's so fundamental to our cognitive architecture or cognitive programming that certain kinds of problems disrupt it. So certain kinds of brain lesions prevent us from doing this. Aspects of Huntington's disease and Parkinson's prevent us from doing this. So at the heart of this is as you say earlier, Rufus, a little bit of a puzzle, which is that you have this emotion, regret. It feels bad, and yet it is ubiquitous. It's part of our cognitive machinery. It's one of the most common emotions we have. And so you have to ask yourself, why? Why is this thing that is unpleasant so ubiquitous? And the answer to me is the way you resolve that riddle is fairly simple, which is that it's useful. It helps us if we treat it right. And that's a big if.
If you were to ask me, having just read the book, what singular data point most emphatically makes the case of the utility of regret, it would be the study that tracked scientists who narrowly won a big prize and those who narrowly lost this prize. The scientists who narrowly lost the prize went on to have more successful careers, if I'm remembering correctly, than those who won. Right. So, I mean, that is extraordinary.
And for reasons that I'll spare you, this is Daoxin Wang at Kellogg. He was able to do some pretty sophisticated statistical analysis to separate out all the other factors that would have determined who flourished and who floundered. But that's just one. What we see is other research showing things like negotiations. So you're in a negotiation, and let's say you finish the negotiation, then you stop and you reflect, and you not only reflect, but you say, what do I regret in that negotiation? What do I regret in this negotiation? That is, you invite this aversive emotion. You don't repel it, you don't ignore it, you invite it. You do better in the next negotiation. Same thing is true with problem-solving strategy and a whole array of things. And so, to me, the key here is that regret is our most, I think, arguably one of our most transformative emotions if we know how to enlist it. And the trouble is that the emotion has been kind of demonized, and we haven't had the guidance that we need to enlist it as a positive force.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for our listeners to know that you have not only read the research on regrets that preceded your study, but you've also conducted a world regret survey, collecting more than 16,000 survey responses from people in 105 countries. And in the process, you've taken this very interesting step, I think, Dan, from being a best-selling author with a knack for pulling together disparate, scientific analysis to help us better understand our behavior, towards actually conducting a large-scale, what sounds like one of the most authoritative studies, and then analyzing the data to uncover what you call the deep structure of regret. I mean, do you see this as a more ambitious project than what you've done in the past, a kind of new role for you?
Well, I don't know if I see it that way. I think it's actually a wave of the future because it's easier to do now than ever before, and that's a huge factor. That's a huge factor. I also did another piece of what you mentioned before, the World Regret Survey, was just a giant collection tool where I asked people around the world to submit a regret, and then I was able to analyze those. We're now over 19,000 from 109 countries. It's crazy how many. It's just incredible how many we have. I also did another piece of research called the American Regret Project, which was a quantitative survey, basically a giant public opinion poll where I worked with a data analytics company, and we put together a sample of 4,489 Americans, a representative sample, so large enough sample so we could weight it by demographic groups. When I first started in this business, there's no way I could have done something like that. No way. It would have been cost prohibitive. The technology wasn't there. Now, the costs have come down, and I can do the analysis on my laptop. I mean, it's incredible what you're able to do right now. And so I think that it's so much easier for individuals to do sophisticated, large-scale research now than ever before. It's really kind of remarkable.
And it helps, as you say, that everybody seems to want to spill out their regrets. And I found this just in the last 2 weeks of talking with friends and Uber drivers and everybody I run into about their regrets. So that certainly helped get to your 16,000 regrets. And traditionally, social scientists who studied regret have looked at categories like romance, education, finance,
right.
health. After doing a deep dive into the data, you concluded that these were just surface regrets, and there's a more revealing, what you call deep structure of regret. Can you tell us about that?
One of the few rewarding things about being a writer is that every once in a while you find something that surprises you, and that surprised me because I was actually trying to crack the nut about what people regretted. And so in my quantitative survey, the American Regret Project, I had people list their regrets, and then I had them slot them into categories like you're talking about. And I found what people have been finding for the last several decades, which is that it's all over the place what people regret. But then when you get into these thousands and thousands of individual regrets and just reading them, you realize you start hearing similar language, you start hearing at some level similar emotional music, and it begins to tell you something. And so what I found is that deep down there are 4 core regrets. One of them is what I call foundation regrets, which are if only I'd done the work. These are regrets that people have about essentially small decisions early in their life that accumulate to negative consequences later on. That's foundation regrets. Boldness regrets are if only I'd taken the chance. And these are regrets that people have about not starting a business, not speaking up, not traveling, not asking out a crush. Again, across different domains, whether it's personal or romance or career or education. They're at a juncture, they can play it safe or they can take the chance. They don't take the chance and they often regret it. Third category, moral regrets, if only I'd done the right thing. And then finally, our connection regrets, which are about relationships, the full gamut of relationships that we have, not only romantic relationships. Actually, in this category, not mostly romantic relationships, just the relationships we have with the people in our lives that come apart, and that's distressing to people. And it's even more distressing when they don't do anything about it.
I love this idea that you share that regrets provide a photographic negative of actions we can take to live a deep, rich, satisfying life, right? That when we look really thoroughly and deeply at kind of the whole landscape of human regret, what we see is a reverse image of how to live a better life, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's part of why it's the. I would imagine that in the question of how to frame the book, the choice of titles, the power of regret, and then subtitle, how looking backwards moves us forwards. It's sort of necessary to make sure the reader understands that this is actually a very empowering book and a very empowering kind of analysis, right? Opposed to being an exercise in studying negative affect.
You're absolutely right in the sense that if you go back to this World Regret Survey and you think about these thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of regrets that are still coming in, yes, people are telling me what they regret, but in doing so, they're also telling me what they value. So if you think about it, if I make a mistake or do something stupid 10 years ago, 20 years, there's so many things that mistakes that I've made that I don't even remember. Okay, like last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years, I don't even remember. But the ones that stick with me are signals. The ones that bother me still are signals. And they're signals about, at some level, what I value. And this is the thing about regret. It's power as an emotion. It clarifies what we value, and it instructs us on how to do better. So I'll give you an example from my own life. So I have some regrets about kindness from earlier in my life. And these regrets are not bullying. I didn't bully anybody, but I was in many situations when I was younger where I saw people not being treated well or being really, not even being like affirmatively hurt, but being excluded, not being, you know what I mean? And I knew it was wrong at the time and I didn't do anything. And it really bugs me. And it's bugged me for decades. Now, that's a signal. That's telling me something. It's telling me Dan, you value kindness. And that's clarifying. So when I tell people that that's a regret, I'm also telling them inadvertently what I value, that I value kindness. And it's also instructing me on how to do better. And so this chorus of people who are telling me their regrets are also telling me what matters to them. And what matters to them is some stability in their life. That's foundation. The chance to learn and grow and lead psychologically rich lives. That's boldness. Being good. doing the right thing, that's moral, and then love, which is connection. And I think that's what makes regret a very clarifying emotion. And what's so clarifying about it is how little national variation there was. That around the world, these things kept coming up over and over again.
So interesting. Well, let's get into the details because there's so much kind of rich and instructive material here. Let's start with foundation regrets. Dan, not to one-up you or anything, but in preparation for this interview, we set up a hotline where folks have been calling in and telling us their biggest regrets.
Okay, cool.
So here's a foundation regret we'd love to share with you.
Okay, yeah, I want to hear.
My biggest regrets would be alcohol and drugs. Looking back, I spent a good 20 years spending way too much time drinking and experimenting with drugs. And I think it was a crutch and forestalled a lot of personal development. While there were some fun times and some interesting insights from the recreational drug part, if I had it to do over again, I would not touch any of it. It was not worth it.
So this is an interesting one to me. Use of alcohol and drugs can clearly be at the expense of foundation building, but there may be other people out there who would see alcohol and drugs as contributing to the process of building connection, right?
Yeah.
But I think that this is clearly a foundation regret for this caller.
It sure sounds that way, and there's a lot in this specific category of alcohol and drugs. What's interesting about this one, Rufus, is that, when you talk about actual addiction, that's a medical issue. It's sometimes about more than personal agency. There could be something medical going on, but what you hear here is and it's interesting just tonally. The person who's calling in, it's more of like a wistful kind of regret. It's not saying, "Oh, I'm such an idiot, I can't believe it." It's like, "Oh man," because it didn't. It kind of the consequences of foundation regrets kind of sneak up on you. I mean, in the book, I talk about that famous scene from a Hemingway novel where these two characters are talking, and one says to the other guy, I went bankrupt. And the other guy says, well, how'd you go bankrupt? And he says, 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. And I think that's the story behind a lot of these foundation regrets. And it sounds like that. I mean, in economic terms, if you spend so much time indulging, there are going to be opportunity costs. And that's what happened here. And there's also a degree of, we sometimes don't factor in opportunity costs. We sometimes engage in what's called temporal discounting, and that we value the pleasure of today way more than the benefit of tomorrow. And that's what it sounds like in this case.
The Anxious Achiever is the podcast about your mental health and your work, where leaders from top companies, entrepreneurs, athletes, celebrities, and leading experts share how they've managed through anxiety, depression, and other mental health challenges, and how they've become better leaders in the process. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll feel seen, and you'll learn great tools and skills. And I guarantee you're gonna look at leadership in a new way. Come find out why we won the Mental Health America 2023 Media Award. Get The Anxious Achiever wherever you find your podcasts.
Hey folks, Rufus here. If you're a fan of our interviews with physicians, scientists, or entrepreneurs, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, Raising Health. Previously called BioEats World, Raising Health comes from leading venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. Each episode, Raising Health dives deep into the heart of healthcare, biotech, and AI with A16Z General Partners. Along the way, they explore the real challenges and opportunities in health and biotech entrepreneurship. Not to mention, you'll hear raw insights and actionable advice from notable guests like Omada CEO and co-founder Sean Duffy, and AI expert and In-Sitro CEO Daphne Kohler. Don't miss out. Follow Raising Health wherever you get your podcasts. Some of the comments from the regret survey are kind of heartbreaking. One of your subjects said, and I'll quote, "I regret not saving money diligently ever since I started working. It's nearly crushing every day to think about how hard I've worked for the last 25 years, but financially I have nothing to show for it. And there were a lot of quotes along those lines. This is not a vague regret. This is an acute kind of pain that a lot of people are feeling.
Yeah, and what's interesting on the financial side is that I don't think there was any. I didn't realize this until a couple of days ago. Is that I don't think there was anybody who regretted being too frugal. I don't think there was anybody who said, "Oh, you know what? I didn't spend enough money." I don't think anybody said that. I think that's very revealing too.
Mm-hmm. It certainly is. Although I will say this is something we'll get into later, but I think that it becomes very interesting to me when some of these kind of instructions for living a better life are potentially in conflict, such as like if you want to start a company and be bold, you might have to risk personal savings, right? There's at some point there are trade-offs, which we'll get to, I think, later on. But, a broader point I'd make on the subject of money is it seems to me that as a culture, at least in this country, we're somewhat conflicted because on the one hand, we love to say that money doesn't make you happy and you should pursue, whatever is your greatest passion, that's what you should do for a living. If you love poetry, you should become a poet. You love music, become a musician. And obviously, this is something that I'm sure you and I both believe to some degree, which is that people should pursue their passions and should love their work. On the other hand, giving yourself permission to be pragmatic about making sure you have a minimum adequate income and a strategy for savings and investment is important. And it's important because to some degree, money does matter, right? And so I think we could benefit from having a slightly more nuanced view as a culture to sort of educate younger people about, how it all works and what the long-term implications are.
Absolutely. I'm someone, I've written about the importance of empathic and artistic skills. I've written about the importance of internal motivation. But you could scour the databases of the world and you will never hear me once say money doesn't matter. Money matters. It matters as a form of motivation and it matters as something pragmatic in your life. That I think that it's actually possible to be both bold and pragmatic at the same time. I don't think there's a necessary trade-off. And a lot of these foundation regrets, if you get them right, it actually gives you the opportunity to be bolder. That is, they're more compatible than antagonistic.
Right. Well,
so for instance, like if you haven't built a sturdy foundation for yourself, then it actually becomes harder to become bold. But if you have built a sturdy foundation for yourself, it might be easier to become bold. So I think there's a compatibility among all of these core regrets. But again, there's some variance from person to person about what they regret the most. I think there's also some variance by stage of life too. Because a lot of the foundation regrets people don't realize until they're a little bit later on.
Absolutely right. And Dan, when you look back at your early years, do you have foundation regrets? Were you diligent and careful with money, health, and education?
I was generally pretty good on this because I've always been a pretty frugal person. Also, for the first 40 years of my life, never really made any money at all. And so I was sort of forced into frugality as a habit. And so I was generally pretty good on these. I could have been better, but foundation regrets are not, those are not my biggest category of regrets.
My one foundation regret is that I wish I picked up playing musical instruments.
Amen.
As a kid and in high school, I see a lot of my friends just really getting a huge amount of joy out of it. But as you would remind me, it's not too late. At the time,
it's not.
Right? I'm 54 years old, but I've got my 11-year-old. I now have all three of my kids. I've encouraged all three of them to pick up instruments, and my 11-year-old is giving me piano lessons on the side.
Well, we can, maybe we can do a Kickstarter campaign among NBIC members to buy you a bassoon and some lessons, and you can get going. It's interesting that you say that, Rufus, because I was just saying this to somebody literally this afternoon, that we're talking, that there were a lot of regrets involving musical instruments. There's one in particular about a guy who started playing the saxophone and he thought it was uncool and stopped playing it. I actually played little known fact, I played the clarinet for a year and just abandoned it. I think it was in 5th grade, abandoned it, and I regret that. So I have some foundation regrets. I wish I had, like on health or even on athletics, I wish I had devoted a little bit more time to explicitly trying to get better as an athlete rather than just playing touch football in the street and pickup basketball and, Little League baseball, which I liked. I love that. But some of me looks back and says, oh, maybe you should have actually, done some deliberate practice and tried to get better at something.
Right. If only we'd read Growth Mindset in
exactly
in the early
in the
80s.
1970s and early 80s. Exactly.
Exactly.
Our lives would be
right.
Our lives would be different.
That's right. Well, and when we think about how we can mitigate foundation regrets, it's obviously the older you are, the harder it is to do anything about it. But I love the Chinese proverb that you quote: "The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today."
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about boldness regrets, which might be my favorite category.
Boldness regrets are a good example of the kind of deep structure regret that transcends the category. So as I was mentioning before, you have a lot of people who, there are a lot of people around the world with this exact same formulation of X years ago, there was a man/woman who I really liked. I wanted to ask her out on a date. I didn't, and I've regretted it ever since. And to me, those are the same as the people who regret sticking in a lackluster job rather than becoming an entrepreneur. Among American college graduates, huge numbers of regrets about not studying abroad. I was shocked by that one. How many people regret that?
Yeah.
And so what does this tell us? I think what it tells us is that we have a fundamental need to learn and grow and lead psychologically rich lives. I'll even go further and to say that I think that in some ways these boldness regrets are a reflection of our knowledge, both explicit and implicit, of our mortality. That we know, human beings are a species, everybody, you and I and everybody listening to this knows we are going to die. And I think that even though we don't think about that every day, and probably shouldn't think about that every day, it's there somewhere in our head, in our mind, in our brain, if we have a soul, in our soul. And I think that deep down, we say, wait a second, I am not here forever. I'm here actually for a vanishingly short amount of time. I got to do something. I got to learn. I got to grow. I got to try stuff. I got to, lead a psychologically rich life. I think boldness regrets spring from that. And the boldness regrets are one of the two biggest categories of regrets.
It's funny. As you know, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've started a series of companies. The first one I started in my 20s, and Next Big Idea Club's number 4. Though it's been a bumpy ride, there are very few things I'm more grateful for than the fact that my younger self summoned the boldness to take that risk. When I look back, if anything, I regret not having been even more bold.
Exactly.
Isn't that funny? And a lot of my friends are also entrepreneurs, and in talking with them in the last few weeks, many of them have said, oh, I could have been more bold in business. And I think you started, quite a few successful enterprises. I'm very surprised you'd say that. But It does seem like that's a pretty consistent appetite people have.
One of the things that surprised me in some of the other regrets is that people are less outcomist than I expected. So I had people who say, I started a business and it flopped. And some people regretted doing that. No question.
Yeah, sure.
But many of them said, I started a business and it flopped, but I'm good because at least I know I tried. But I want to emphasize for listeners that boldness is about way more than starting a business. It's about just trying stuff. It's about speaking up. It's about assertiveness. And when we think about speaking up as a regret, which was a surprisingly common regret, the thing about regret that makes it different from other emotions is that regret requires agency. Regret is your fault. Regret is not disappointment. And so sometimes we overstate how much agency we have. So a lot of the speaking up regrets, I wanted to say to people, listen, you're in an organization that isn't giving you psychological safety. You're in a context where you don't feel like you can speak up. So it's not entirely on you, these regrets about speaking up. And I think that these regrets are also signals for organizations about the kinds of cultures that they want to establish. You want to establish a culture, for instance, that gives people some stability and predictability. You want to establish a culture where people can be bold. They don't have to exit the organization in order to exercise their boldness.
Absolutely. Well, on the subject of speaking up regrets, this is a different flavor of speaking up regrets we have from a caller named Rick.
Hi, this is Rick. My biggest regret is in January of 2017. I was at a restaurant in Washington, D.C. with my family celebrating my wife's birthday. And as we were getting ready to leave, an SUV pulled up and a guy got out and went to the hostess desk. And my wife looked at me and said, "That looks like Jimmy Buffett. You should go say something." And I convinced myself that it was not Jimmy Buffett. And in fact, it was. And I never said anything. And I'm a huge Jimmy Buffett fan. And I will regret that forever.
So what do you think, Dan? Did Rick miss out on the opportunity to become buddies with Jimmy Buffett?
Well, I don't. Here's the thing, Rick. Who knows? I mean, Jimmy Buffett's probably not going to become BFFs with Rick. But here's the thing: you can tell in his voice, this bothers Rick because he didn't step up and do something. I actually think that if Rick had gone up to him and said, "Hey, Mr. Buffett, I'm a big fan," and Jimmy Buffett said, "Screw you, I'm going to Margaritaville. I don't want to talk to you," Rick would have been fine. But it's the not knowing, and I think it's really telling. It's less about the outcome.
Yeah.
Like I don't think Rick imagined that he would be on tour with Jimmy Buffett or they'd be hanging out fishing or something like that. I think it was just simply that he had that moment and he could have stepped up and he didn't, and it bugs him. Yeah. Because at some level, Rick knows that he's not going to be on this planet forever. And that you have to make the most of your limited time here. And if talking to Jimmy Buffett is how you want to do that, go for it.
Yeah.
But I think the broader lesson here in general on these regrets is that we should have at least something of a bias for action.
Well, it strikes me too that it may be possible that we humans are just fundamentally over-indexed towards cautiousness, right? I mean, we know we suffer from loss aversion, which is a logical fallacy. We're very protective of what we have and fear risking it, even if the odds are in our favor. And that loss aversion might have been appropriate in a world of greater scarcity, but we live in a world of abundance, and really, as you say, bias towards action tends to get rewarded over time. So that's such a good point. The other thing that I learned from this research is that we are over-indexed on fears of awkwardness. Yes. Yes.
Not even so much risk, but I guess that's a form of risk. It's a kind of like a personal risk. We so are over-indexed on awkwardness. Our fears about things being awkward are way in excess to what they really are. And this is one of the big issues with connection regrets. That people fear that if they reach out to somebody who they haven't talked to for a while, it's going to feel really awkward. And they also feel like the other side's not going to care, and they're wrong on both fronts. Let's
talk about moral regrets. It really lifted my spirits to learn how many people had regrets about having been bullies to other kids like 10, 20, 30, 50 years earlier.
Why did it lift your spirits?
I mean, it just never occurred to me that there were people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s sitting around feeling badly that they bullied a kid in grade school. I mean, it was a complete surprise to me.
Mm-hmm. And that's affirming because you feel like, oh, they knew that what they were doing is wrong, and it's like it's a testament to their goodness.
Absolutely. I mean, that clearly it's an indication that the people are just a little bit better. That clearly we think of. It's very easy to think of bullying as sort of just fundamental human evilness or meanness or cruelty. But imagining someone suffering from the memory of having bullied for decades and decades and decades, we see that probably it was an insecure child who was making decisions for the wrong reasons, who paid dues for those poor choices.
Great point.
For decades. It's kind of heartbreaking and sweet.
Yeah, great point. Great point. I had a woman who I interviewed who bullied a kid. She was I think she was 50, maybe early 50s. She had bullied a kid when she was, I think, 8 or 9 years old, and she started crying in this interview.
Wow.
40 years later.
Amazing. Do you have any moral regrets, Dan?
Well, I think that I would put the kindness regrets that I have as a moral regret. It's weird because most moral regrets are actions. I bullied somebody. I cheated on my spouse. I swindled a business partner. I hurt another human being. But for me, my moral regret is inaction because I'm just thinking of it. I'm literally picturing certain incidents.
Interesting.
Where there was clearly somebody was being excluded, not being treated well, and I didn't do anything. I just stood by. And it's not like, oh, I didn't know it was really wrong. I knew it at the time. And I didn't do anything. And I think that to me is that's one of my most irritating moral regrets.
Yeah. When I was I think a sophomore in college, I came home for vacation. And when I left, I'd gone down to the basement and we might say I borrowed a couple bottles of red wine from my father's stash in the basement and had them in my duffel bag. My father took me to the airport to fly back. And back then, you could go all the way to through security to the gate. And so my father, took me through security, and they found the 2 bottles of wine and took them out because it was not compliant with the, I couldn't take a carry-on with wine. And seeing my father's look of disappointment, seeing that I'd basically stolen 2 bottles of wine from him, just crushed me. And of course, he gave me the 2 bottles of wine and said, "These are for you, you take them," in a sort of Les Miserables, candlestick moment. And he has a flair for drama. And I sat there and I cried on the airplane, and I wrote this sort of like teary note to my parents telling them how ashamed I was. And I just, but it undoubtedly influenced future decisions, right? That sort of the pain of that. But I have to say, to be critical to myself, had the 2 bottles of wine not been discovered, I would not have had that experience, right? And I don't know that I would. I mean, I don't know that I would be talking about it today, right?
Interesting.
So I think there's an interesting kind of layer to the question of moral regrets, which is, we certainly regret immoral action. We regret even more immoral action that's called out and for which we suffer direct consequences. I mean, this is why we need to, kids need to get caught shoplifting, and I needed to get caught lifting some wine.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about that, I think what it says about you is that you're it's not like you stole from a store, and it's not like you stole anything super valuable, and it's not like you toted a gun into 7-Eleven or anything like that. It's like you took 2 bottles of wine from your own parents. But again, this is the thing that's so interesting is some of the idiosyncrasies, and particularly it comes up with moral regrets, because I think there's a general consensus that stealing is wrong, and there's a general consensus that hurting other people is wrong and cheating other people is wrong. There are other aspects of moral regrets that are actually much more complicated. So I think one of the really interesting ones is the number of people I have who regret not serving, a moral regret of not serving in the U.S. military, and not because. And they're not boldness regrets as you look at the texture of it. It's not saying, "Oh, I missed out on the adventure." They're saying, "Hey, I had a duty to serve. You have to serve your country. Other people are fighting for us. I need to stand up for us, and I didn't do it, and that's a betrayal." And you have some people who look at I've had this experience on the road. Some people who look at those regrets and say, "What are you talking about? That's not a moral regret." And my view to them is like, you don't get to decide what someone's moral regret is. They decide. And so there are other, it's as Jonathan Haidt has said in his brilliant book, The Righteous Mind, and his work on moral foundations theory, that there are multiple moral taste buds and we don't share all of them. And there are certain kinds of moral values like duty and loyalty and sanctity where there's not a complete consensus on. And that's why moral regrets are the smallest category, but in some ways the most idiosyncratic and the most deeply felt.
Well, let's talk about the last category, which is connection regrets. Any big picture comments on connection regrets?
Some of it goes to what we were talking about earlier, which is about awkwardness. Basically, connection regrets are relationships that were intact, should have been intact. They come apart. They usually come apart in undramatic ways. They drift apart rather than explode. And somebody wants to reach out. They say, "Oh, it's going to be awkward if I reach out." And the other side's not going to care. And I just want to really emphasize on that. We're almost always wrong on both of those things. I mean, almost always, enough so that you should just disregard both of those presumptions. When people do reach out, it's way less awkward than they think. And the other side almost always cares. And so if there's a takeaway from the connection regrets, and there has been for me, Rufus, personally, it's always reach out. If you're at a juncture where you're saying, "Oh, should I reach out or should I not reach out?" you have answered the question. Being at that juncture has answered the question for you. Always reach out.
One of the things that surprised me in my own life, Dan, you may be curious to know if you found this, is how many people have these sort of failed relationships or kind of relationships gone cold in their lives, whether it's like relatives of mine who didn't speak with their siblings for 20 years and over the silliest things, right? And I've had in my own business life like 2 kind of business/friendship relationships that over the course of a couple decades of building businesses went cold. One of them, I reached out and had exactly the response that was predicted, really warm response. And I have a little more work to do. But do you think that, I mean, it strikes me that this is remarkably common that, people have these relationships gone cold and it eats at them.
Yeah, it's the biggest category. You're exactly right. And a lot of them are, as I said earlier, the way that these relationships come apart, every once in a while you have people throwing plates and swearing at each other and vowing never to speak again. But that's the exception. Most of them are about drifting apart, where there wasn't a galvanizing event. There wasn't some kind of cataclysm that cleaved the relationship in two parts. It was just drifting ever so slowly. And what happens is that when you bow to the fears of awkwardness, and when your presumptions about what the other side wants are wrong, you end up drifting even further. So if you're concerned about awkwardness and you wait, it's only going to feel more awkward later on. But the thing is, once again, I'm telling you, I didn't realize this until doing this research, but I feel like human beings' predictions of how awkward things are going to feel are almost always radically overstated. In any aspect of life, we should just push past the fears of awkwardness. It's almost always overblown. What's more is that in your case, the case that you're talking about, suppose you had reached out to one of these folks and he or she said, "Screw you." I mean, how would you feel about that?
Yeah, that's liberating. It's liberating.
Yeah, exactly.
I reached out, right.
Right, exactly. So it's not even so much the outcome as it is, once again, we have a theme emerging here on this program, it's the bias for action. It's doing something.
Yeah, and actually on the subject of the bias for action, we have one call-in regret that is related to the bias for action.
I regret that I didn't ask my grandmother, who died about 10 years ago, I didn't ask her about what life would have been like for her family in Ukraine, where she came from when she was only 2. She didn't remember it, of course, but she grew up with her mother. In fact, her mother lived for quite a while, and they certainly could have talked about it. She didn't seem interested in talking about it, but I regret that I didn't ask and learn a little bit about that family history.
That seems to be one that comes up
a lot. And that's what I like to call a closed door regret. Like that regret from that caller, he can't do anything about that. And so what you want to do is you want to avoid getting to that point. So if there's another takeaway, I mean, sort of a micro takeaway from always reach out is always ask people for their stories. And another one that comes up a lot is always go to the funeral.
Yes.
I'm leery about saying things without any equivocation, without any saying probabilistic bent to it. But I think this is the case where it's like, always get the stories, always go to the funeral, always reach out.
Yeah, it also strikes me that developing a habit of reaching out to old friends with some regularity can make a big difference in life. I love the John Lennon quote, "Measure your life in friends, not years." We have the potential in life to have an ever-growing number of kind of loving connections, but it requires kind of maintaining all those. People move to different cities. And so as a very small thing, at some point, maybe 10 years ago, I decided like, you know what, whenever I'm in the back of an Uber and I have an extra 5 or 10 minutes, I'm just going to call an old friend that I haven't talked to in 6 to 12 months. And just talking once or twice a year with someone who was really close to me, decades ago, is enough to really, bring that warmth back into your life.
Right. Right. You used a very interesting word in the build up to that, Rufus, which you described it as loving connections. And I think that's actually a really important word in that what are people looking for in connections is love. When we think about love in the popular parlance, we tend to think too much about romantic love and too little about the kind of love that you're talking about, which is sometimes called companionate love. And that's actually really, really important part of our lives. It's and this is again one of the I don't want to get woo-woo on you, but the person, anytime you write a book, the person who emerges at the end is going to be somewhat different from the person who started it.
Yeah.
And for me, the person who emerged at the end of this major project is a much deeper believer has a new conception of love, a wider, broader, more inclusive notion of love.
Hey, it's Caleb, the show's producer. Rufus is currently busy practicing the bassoon, so it's my incredible honor to tell you about the Next Big Idea app. Hey, Rufus, I'm trying to record in here. First, let me read you a regret from Dan Pink's World Regret Survey. A 33-year-old Michigan man said, I regret that I didn't appreciate reading earlier in life. Now I see the value of reading and often wonder what the compounding effect would have been if I'd started 10 or 15 years earlier. Well, Mr. Michigander, if you're listening to this, and I hope you are, I have some great news for you. You can supercharge your reading habit by downloading the Next Big Idea app. It has text and audio summaries of the best new books, written and read by the authors themselves. We call these summaries Book Bites, and our app has hundreds of them. With Book Bites, you can read a book in the time it takes to polish a pair of Italian loafers. You'll also find professionally narrated summaries of classic books like Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Workweek and Carol Dweck's Mindset, plus conversations with our curators, scintillating e-courses, ad-free versions of this podcast, and tons of other great stuff. There's no better way to get smart fast or make up for lost reading time. Download the Next Big Idea app today.
Well, Dan, I'm interested now in that we've been through the 4 major categories of core regrets, and we know that we can see here a kind of inverse image of how we can live the good life. We can invest in building strong foundations early in life. We can take risks, be bold, do the right thing. We can connect. But, I'm interested, it seems to me that the challenge is in to what degree these different mandates sometimes come into conflict. The finite medium we're working with is life, is time, right? We have a finite amount of time. And so it strikes me that particularly early on, and I see this with kids in high school, right? And you're very familiar with this world, that this question of, for young people, how much do I prioritize education and skill building, which everybody's telling me this is utterly critical, and it's this incredibly high pressure time in my life to, demonstrate my skills and build this educational foundation. But at the same time, every part of my body is telling me that I should be connecting with other humans and building valuable relationships, right? There's sometimes a zero-sum game between some of these elements. How do you think about that?
I think it's important to understand where there are zero sum, what in life in general, what's zero sum and what's positive sum. And so I feel like a lot of what you're calling skill building among young people, if it were skill building, I'd be less distressed by it. I'd be less distressed by trading off connection for building skills. But I think that what's happening in many of the cases is they're not building skills; they're just acquiring credentials. That is actually not skill building. That there isn't deep learning. There isn't a move toward mastery. It's a move toward it's much more performative. It's much more resume buffing. And when you're trading resume entries for close connections, that's generally a pretty bad bargain. The other thing is that if we're talking about genuine skill building, that can often be done collaboratively. How do you think athletes build skills? They would do it together. How do you think musicians build skills? They do it together. How do you think actors and directors build skills? They do it together. I wish that, having 2 kids already out of college, 1 kid in college, I feel like the certainly the higher education system and the higher education system is really not focused much on skill building. I don't think it's focused much on deep learning either. I think it's focused on credentialism more than anything else.
Well, Dan, near the end of the book, you share a handful of techniques that readers can use to harness the power of regret. One of those techniques is creating a failure resume, which you describe as a thorough inventory of our flops. And you say, Dan, that you yourself compiled a failure resume a few years ago, but you decided not to include it in the book.
Oh, and there's no way.
Now, I have to assume, Dan, that you regard that decision as a classic boldness regret. So I want to give you the opportunity to make up for it now. Would you like to share a few items from your failure resume with our listeners?
Yeah, so I'm willing to share a few things. Let me just give you some background on what a failure resume is. So it's not my idea. It's an idea from Tina Seelig at Stanford. And as you say, Rufus, it's a thorough inventory of your screw-ups and your mistakes and your flops. What I like to do is list them in one column. In the second column, list what lesson you learned. And then in the third column, list what you're going to do about it. Like, there were a couple of jobs that I took early in my life. I don't even know what the hell I was thinking. They were just ridiculous. It was a colossal mistake. It was just terrible. I mean, they really brought me down, and so I consider that a mistake. But then when I unpack the mistake, what I realized is that I basically went in being too sure of myself, not asking enough questions, not doing enough due diligence, not understanding what things were really like working there. Or if you think about something like my decision to go to law school, I don't want to harp on that. But what's ridiculous about that is that I went to law school having never visited a law school, having never sat in a law school class, and having never talked to a lawyer about what she actually did for a living. That's pathetic. I realize these like flops and things come back to this underlying problem of assuming too much, assuming that I knew how situations worked, assuming that I knew what it was going to be like somewhere, not doing enough due diligence, not doing enough surrogation, not asking enough questions, going in this very kind of a way that combined both laziness and arrogance, and it really bit me in a couple of circumstances. So I don't do that now. Another one is that there are a couple of projects that I've done that never went anywhere. They just completely fizzled and floundered and were just complete disasters. They weren't even they were quiet disasters. They weren't even like flaming horrific disasters. I think are okay. This is actually a kind of a sadder, quieter disasters. And as I unpacked some of those, one of the reasons was that I committed to doing things that I wasn't fully into. That is, I wasn't 100% on board. I wasn't really into it, and I was only partially committed, and that created the seeds for failure. And that taught me that, in to use Derek Sivers' terminology, that if it's not a hell yes, it's a no. So that helped me. And there are other ones where it just, I might think of it as a failure or a flop. And when I look at it, it's like, well, I don't know if there was a lesson. Just sometimes things don't work out.
And also you point out that writing about and thinking through your regrets is productive and tends to be useful and constructive for people in a way that analyzing the joys in our life is not.
Exactly right. Here's what we know, that emotions are amorphous. They're blobby. They're abstract. And so that's what makes positive emotions feel good. It's what makes negative emotions feel bad. And so with negative emotions, if we write about them especially, and so James Pennebaker at Texas has done a lot of work on this, if we write about our negative emotions, our negative experiences, we defang them. We take this blobby abstraction and convert it into concrete words, which are far less fearsome. And so that's inherently good, but it also begins the sense-making process, that we begin to be able, we're better able to extract meaning and guidance from them, from these concrete words rather than from these blobby abstractions.
Well, clearly the process of writing this book, Dan, has been a wonderful study in all of your inadequacies. I loved your quote. You said at one point towards the end, "I regret not taking enough entrepreneurial and creative risks, not being as bold as my privilege allows and my heart desires. Now, stay tuned." Dan, you have us on the edge of our seats.
I got nothing to announce. Sorry.
Oh, no preview of creative risks that might be coming down the pike?
No. But I'll let you in on a secret. That could have been what we sometimes think of as a commitment contract. That is, by declaring that publicly, I forced myself to do that. There's the old Texas anecdote where you're walking along and there's a very high wall and you're like, how the hell am I going to get over that wall? And the move is you throw your hat over the wall and you're like, okay, my hat's over the wall. Now I got to find a way over it.
Yeah. All right. So all we get is the hat, apparently.
Yeah.
Well, once they come to fruition, we hope you'll come back on the show to tell us about them.
Absolutely, because I'll be desperately trying to flack it as I do with almost everything I do.
Well, you do it very effectively. Well, thank you, Dan, for taking time out of your writing of books and learning of Spanish and your new top secret entrepreneurial activities to be with us here today. Such a pleasure.
I really enjoyed it, Rufus. Thanks so much. You reminded me of a lot that I hadn't really thought about in this book, particularly the particularly the bias for action and how much we're just woefully over-indexed on awkwardness. So I'm going to try to be less concerned about awkwardness and more concerned about action.
Yes, no. We'll have to have an extremely awkward and action-filled second half of our lives, Dan, if we can arrange it. I think that's a good strategy.
Man. We better.
I'm in. I'm all in. Dan Pink's new book is The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. If you want to learn more about the book or share some of your regrets with Dan, visit worldregretsurvey.com. And I have some good news. The next box delivered to hardback subscribers of the Next Big Idea Club will contain The Power of Regret, as well as curator Susan Cain's new book, Bittersweet. This means that members will have the privilege of discussing their regrets with Dan and enjoying an e-course that he's creating based on the book. Join us at nextbigideaclub.com. If you're chomping at the bit to get a little more Daniel Pink in your life, download the Next Big Idea app and check out the wonderful book bite he made for The Power of Regret, where he summarizes the book's 5 key insights in 11 minutes of audio. And don't stop there. In our app, you'll also find beautiful audio and video e-courses, conversations with our curators, including Dan, and audio summaries of new and classic books. Search for Next Big Idea in your app store. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the Next Big Idea app, or wherever you're listening right now. This episode was written and produced by Caleb Bissinger. Our executive producer is Michael Kavnat. Sound designed by Mike Toda. We have no regrets about working with the team at LinkedIn. I'm your host, Rufus Griscom. See you next week.